When the ancient bells of Rome finally fell silent, it wasn't the end of everything. It was only the beginning of another story, a story that would grow in the shadows of a timeless city, sprouting among ruins, echoes, and quiet hopes. While the West crumbled under the weight of invasions, decay, and fragmentation, in the East, something pulsed silently. A transformation unfolded, unseen by many, but inevitable for history. It was the rebirth of an empire, not born from conquest, but from continuity, inheritance, from the breath of an ancient greatness that refused to die. Thus was born Byzantium, or as it would later be called, the Eastern Roman Empire. The city of Byzantium, a modest Greek colony by the Bosphorus Strait, was chosen by Emperor Constantine as the new capital of the empire in 330 AD. But why? Wasn't Rome, the eternal city, enough? In truth, no. Rome at the time was overburdened, vulnerable, entangled in its own webs of power and decadence. The world was changing, and Constantine's keen eyes saw in the east the promise of stability, wealth, and strategic centrality. Constantinople, as the city was renamed in his honor, became a meeting point between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, a beacon between worlds. And it was there that a new empire began to take shape, not through a dramatic rupture, but through an almost organic transition. Latin was still spoken, emperors still held Roman titles, legions still marched under golden eagles, but the spirit had shifted. A more Hellenic, more Eastern, more spiritual essence was emerging. What was being born wasn't a new empire, but an old one in new clothing, adapted, reimagined, reborn. The Byzantine Empire, though it never called itself that, its people always considered themselves Romans, would become the direct heir of ancient Rome for more than 1,000 years. During the 4th and early 5th centuries, the eastern capital thrived. Constantinople was fed by massive aqueducts. Its markets buzzed with goods from India, China, and Africa, and its administration grew ever more sophisticated. Meanwhile, on the other side of the empire, the Western legions fought against the inevitable. Germanic tribes, Huns, Vandals, and Visigoths pressed at the borders. In 410, Rome was sacked by Alaric and the Visigoths. In 476, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. The West plunged into darkness, while the East shone. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Empire stood alone, and in that solitude, it flourished. There was no more duality. It was the empire, the only one that remained, and as such, it had to redefine itself. Once merely the eastern half of Rome, it now became the living heart of surviving Rome, but not a pagan, expansionist, militarized Rome. Instead, a Christian, Orthodox, deeply spiritual Rome, bureaucratic and culturally diverse. Administrative structures were refined, the army reformed, and the Christian faith became the central axis of its existence. While the West dissolved into feuds and tribal conflict, Constantinople built churches, codified laws, preserved classical knowledge, and maintained relations with distant peoples. The Byzantine Empire wasn't just a wall against advancing powers. It was a guardian of civilization. It safeguarded the manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato, the medical treatises of Hippocrates, the legal texts of Rome, and the Christian Gospels. It was a repository of the ancient world, adapted for the needs of a changing one. But that role came with a burden. The inheritance of Rome was heavy, ruling a multicultural empire, confronting threats on many fronts, and maintaining the legitimacy of an empire no longer stretching to Britain or Gaul, required more than just military strength. It required diplomacy, intelligence, faith, and at times, a game of intrigue as complex as a chessboard. Thus, the Byzantine Empire developed one of the most refined diplomatic systems in history, negotiating with Persians, Arabs, Franks, Slavs, and even with the Crusaders, who one day would betray it. Yet, in that dawn of its history, there was still hope. The Constantinople of Constantine, Theodosius, Arcadius, was a living, breathing city, where cathedrals rose under golden domes and palace corridors echoed with liturgical chants. It was a city of contrasts, white marble and shadowy alleys, saints and spies, pious emperors and ambitious generals. A city where time seemed suspended, where the Roman past and medieval future coexisted like blood brothers. And it was there, between colossal walls and illuminated manuscripts, that the Byzantine Empire took its first step toward eternity. An empire forged in transition, nourished by memory, and sustained by the belief that even when everything seems to collapse, it is still possible to rise again. It was a city built not only upon stone and mortar, but upon symbols, dreams, and millennia of ambition. Constantinople was not just the capital of an empire, it was a mirror of the world, a city between worlds, between eras, between gods and emperors, a place where the echo of Roman legions still lingered in the stones of the walls, even as Christian bells called the faithful to prayer. Constantinople was the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, but it was also its soul. And to truly understand it, one must take a deep breath, silence the present, and dive into time. Picture yourself walking the streets of Constantinople in the 9th century. The sounds of merchants mix with the scent of spices from the east. The sun glistens on the golden domes of Hagia Sophia, casting a gentle light on the white marble beneath your feet. There are crowds, Syrians, Greeks, Armenians, Latins, Africans, each speaking their language, wearing their colors, trading their goods. Constantinople was a cauldron, but also a mosaic, a city where East and West not only met, but coexisted. In the distance rose the Theodosian walls, an engineering marvel so formidable that, for nearly 1,000 years, it kept the city safe from sieges, invaders, and disasters. 3 layers of defense: inner walls, outer walls, and a moat, each more daunting than the last. It was as if the city itself were a fortress of faith and power. And beyond those walls, the Sea of Marmara stretched like a liquid mirror, reflecting ships arriving from Alexandria, Antioch, Venice, Carthage, and even distant India. Constantinople was the center of maritime routes, a vital node of the Silk Road, a gateway to unimaginable riches. But it wasn't commerce alone that made Constantinople a treasure. It was how past and present intertwined. Roman forums still stood, with their Corinthian columns, marble statues, and Latin inscriptions. But beside them rose churches with golden icons, monasteries hidden among gardens, and fountains where monks whispered psalms. Constantinople was Rome, but it was also Jerusalem, a city where saints' relics sat beside Plato's dialogues, where the emperor's throne stood near the altar of God. And at the heart of this city, Hagia Sophia rose like a miracle. Commissioned by Justinian, it remained for centuries the largest cathedral in the world. Its interior, aglow with hundreds of windows and golden mosaics, made visitors feel as if they had stepped into heaven itself. The emperor's words upon its completion echoed through the ages. Solomon, I have surpassed you. Hagia Sophia was not just a church. It was a declaration of power, faith, and glory. It was the essence of the Byzantine spirit, grand, sacred, eternal. The streets were paved with polished stones. Aqueducts brought fresh water from distant hills. Underground cisterns stored this precious resource like an invisible treasure. There were public baths, arenas, schools, libraries. The market stretched through entire districts. The Forum of Constantine, with its flaming column, was a hub of debate, gossip, and intrigue. And within the great palace, the emperor, regarded as the viceroy of God on earth, ruled beneath golden ceilings, surrounded by bureaucrats, counselors, generals, theologians, and invisible enemies. Yet Constantinople was also a city of shadows, alleys where spies lurked, secret tunnels where letters and threats passed silently, hidden chambers where quiet decisions shaped the fate of empires. The Byzantine bureaucracy was a labyrinth, and those who couldn't navigate it were soon forgotten. The city was beautiful, but unforgiving. Power changed hands like a trembling torch in the wind, and many who feasted in palaces today might awaken tomorrow in exile, blinded or dead. Still, Constantinople captivated. Visitors from the West spoke of it with reverence. Pilgrims, merchants, and ambassadors were awestruck by its wealth, its order, its faith. It was said the entire world was a ring, and Constantinople was the jewel at its center. And even those who came with hostile intent, like the Crusaders or the Arabs, could not deny the grandeur of that metropolis. The city endured everything: Persian sieges, Arab invasions, Slavic raids, earthquakes, fires, plagues. It would fall, and it would rise again. It was as if the city had a soul of its own, fed by prayers, chants, bells, and the sinister whispers of the court. Constantinople was invincible, until one day it would not be. But that part of the story is still to come. For now, just imagine the city on a calm morning. The bells ring, the markets open, the emperor walks the marble halls, and a distant ship appears on the horizon, bringing news from lands most will never even hear of. Constantinople lives, and in living, it tells stories. Stories of faith, of power, of beauty, and of destiny. There are encounters that change destinies. There are alliances that write eternal pages. But few stories compare to the union of Justinian and Theodora. It wasn't merely a marriage. It was a silent revolution. An emperor born in the dust of a peasant village, and an empress who had known the world from the roar of the arenas to the perfumed halls of the great palace. They did not come from noble bloodlines, nor did they carry imperial names, but they carried something far rarer: vision, ambition, and an unrelenting spirit. Together, they didn't just rule the Byzantine Empire, they rebuilt it. Justinian was born around the year 482 in Taurisium, in the Balkans, the son of Latin-speaking peasants. His uncle, Justin, rose through the military ranks and eventually became emperor. It was he who opened the gates of the imperial court for his young nephew, who would be educated in Constantinople's finest schools. But Justinian, as he would later be called, was more than a diligent student. He was a man obsessed with order, greatness, and eternity. From early on, he dreamed of something beyond the throne, the restoration of Roman glory. And then came Theodora. Daughter of a bear trainer and an actress, she grew up backstage at the Hippodrome, among cheering crowds, dramatic scenes, and the rawness of the streets. As a young woman, she gained fame as an actress and courtesan, professions scorned by the elites, yet ones that taught her how to read people, master silence, and navigate the invisible game of power. Her intelligence sparkled, and her presence captivated. When she met Justinian, many foresaw scandal. But he saw in her a strength that few dared to recognize. He fought to change the laws so he could marry her, and he succeeded. Because Justinian, like Theodora, did not accept limits imposed by tradition. With his coronation in 527, began one of the most ambitious and transformative reigns in Byzantine history. Justinian did not merely want to preserve the empire, he wanted to restore old Rome. To do so, he launched bold military campaigns under his trusted general, Belisarius. He recaptured North Africa from the Vandals, reclaimed Italy from the Ostrogoths, and advanced into parts of Spain. For a brief moment, the empire's borders expanded once more, resembling the imperial maps of the past. But war came at a price. And amid these battles, another conflict ignited at the very heart of the capital. In 532, Constantinople erupted in rebellion. Tensions between rival factions of the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, escalated into a devastating uprising known as the Nika Revolt. Rioters set entire districts ablaze, demanded the emperor's deposition, and proclaimed a new ruler. Justinian, shaken, considered fleeing. But it was Theodora who rose before the imperial council and delivered one of the most memorable lines in imperial history. "The purple is a noble shroud." For her, it was better to die as empress than live in exile. That sentence, cold, resolute, final, became the turning point. Justinian responded with fury. He ordered Belisarius and his men to crush the revolt. Within hours, 10,000 lives were lost. But the throne was saved. With the capital in ruins, Justinian seized the moment to create something monumental. Upon the ashes of the old cathedral, he built Hagia Sophia. And he did not merely build, it transcended. It was a structure without precedent, blending engineering, faith, and beauty in sublime harmony. It was as if he sought to carve in stone that the Byzantine Empire was more than resilience. It was creation. And beside him, Theodora played a role far beyond that of a consort. She intervened in politics, welcomed ambassadors, protected persecuted heretics, and founded convents and shelters for vulnerable women. While he restored the empire's form, she reshaped its soul. Together, they also reformed the law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or Justinian Code, reorganized the tangled web of Roman law into a logical, influential system whose echoes still resonate in Western legal traditions today. It was an attempt to bring order to chaos, to place justice at the foundation of power. And in many ways, it reflected the emperor's own nature, rational, rigorous, tireless. But not everything was light. The reign was also marked by plague, unending wars, rising taxes, and growing unrest. The bubonic plague that struck Constantinople in 541 devastated the city. Hundreds of thousands are thought to have died, and Justinian himself fell ill, though he survived. It was a dark time, when grandeur coexisted with despair, and yet the imperial machine continued to turn. The domes of Hagia Sophia still shimmered, scribes still copied ancient texts, and the borders were still defended. Theodora died in 548, long before Justinian. Her passing cast a heavy shadow over the palace. Though Justinian would go on to rule for nearly 2 more decades, he was never quite the same. The empire's flame still burned, but its intensity had dimmed. When he died in 565, he left behind an empire expanded, reformed, glorious, but also exhausted. Justinian and Theodora did not merely mark an era. They forged the identity of the Byzantine Empire. They proved that it wasn't noble blood, but vision and courage that define a ruler. They gave the empire a second foundation, a second soul. And even though the centuries that followed would be filled with crisis, invasion, and decline, something from that golden age endured. A distant glow, an example of power that dared to dream, and that, for one brief moment, touched the impossible. If stone walls protected Constantinople from visible invaders, there was another wall, more subtle, more silent, yet just as powerful. A wall made of doctrines, creeds, sacred rituals, and divine symbols. It was an invisible barrier, but one that separated worlds. At the heart of the Byzantine Empire stood not only the emperor's throne, but the altar of faith, a faith that shaped laws, wars, alliances, and identities. And over the centuries, that faith would become both the force that united the Byzantine people and the chasm that separated them from the rest of Christendom. Since Constantine the Great, Christianity had become more than a religion. It was the bridge between heaven and earth, the foundation of imperial authority, the language of politics and morality. The emperor was not merely a secular ruler. He was seen as the Isa Apostolos, the equal of the apostles. His throne was not only gilded, it was sacred. In Byzantium, church and state did not compete. They intertwined. The Patriarch of Constantinople, though beneath the emperor, was the second most powerful figure in the empire. His voice echoed through pulpits, councils, and even the battlefield. But like any wall, this one was built brick by brick, amid disputes, councils, and theological controversies. In the centuries following the founding of Constantinople, Christianity underwent profound transformations. Ecumenical councils were convened to define what was orthodox and what was heresy. The Council of Nicaea, of Chalcedon, of Ephesus, each shaped imperial theology. Abstract concepts like the nature of Christ, the Trinity, the virginity of Mary, all were debated with near fanatical intensity. For the Byzantines, to err in faith was to err at the heart of reality. One of the most dramatic moments in this spiritual journey was the crisis of iconoclasm. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, the empire was gripped by a fierce debate. Were icons, sacred images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, legitimate objects of veneration, or veiled forms of idolatry? Emperors like Leo III and Constantine V banned the use of images, ordered mosaics destroyed, monasteries closed, and resistant monks punished. The people resisted. Some hid icons in secret. Others died defending them. Churches stood bare, walls stripped of art. It was as if the soul of the empire was at war with itself. Iconoclasm was not merely a matter of aesthetics or doctrine. It revealed an empire divided between tradition and reform, between centralized power and local devotions, between visual spirituality and rigid dogma. In the end, the defenders of images prevailed. The restoration of icon veneration in 843 was celebrated as a triumph of orthodoxy. And Byzantine art, rich, symbolic, golden, transcendental, flourished once again. But the scars remained, and faith, once unifying, became increasingly a line of division. Then came the greatest rupture, the Schism of 1054. After centuries of growing tension between the Church of Constantinople and that of Rome, the break became inevitable. Many points of contention had accumulated. The use of leavened or unleavened bread in the Eucharist, the authority of the Pope over all patriarchs, the addition of the filioque clause to the Creed, a small phrase but theologically explosive. The East affirmed that the Holy Spirit proceeded only from the Father. The West declared, from the Father, and out the Son. In 1054, a millennium of Christian unity unraveled. In a gesture both symbolic and tragic, Cardinal Humbert, representing Pope Leo IX, entered the Hagia Sophia and laid a bull of excommunication upon the altar against Patriarch Michael Cerularius. In return, the Patriarch issued his own excommunication. The divide was sealed. Rome and Constantinople, once sisters in faith, were now estranged, and this schism would not heal, not even after centuries of bloodshed and failed reconciliations. Yet the impact of Orthodox faith transcended imperial borders. Byzantine missionaries like Cyril and Methodius brought Christianity and the Cyrillic alphabet to the Slavic peoples. The baptism of Prince Vladimir of Kiev in the 10th century marked the Christianization of Russia, which would inherit much of Byzantium's liturgy, architecture, and worldview. And so, even when Byzantium itself would vanish, its faith would survive elsewhere as an eternal flame. The Orthodox Church, with its solemn liturgy, sacred icons, deep chants, and mystical traditions, became the spiritual heart of the empire. It gave meaning to existence, to politics, to art, to suffering, and to glory. And even as emperors fell, as borders shrank, as walls trembled, faith endured. It united peasants and aristocrats, soldiers and monks, sailors and artists. It transformed Constantinople not merely into a capital, but into a holy city. That invisible wall, built from symbols and dogmas, continued to rise long after the empire's fall. It survived the Crusaders' siege, the Ottoman conquest, wars and migrations. It lived on in monasteries hidden in the mountains, in candlelit churches, in voices still chanting psalms in ancient Greek. For the Byzantine Empire may have fallen, but its faith never bowed. Throughout its long existence, the Byzantine Empire was like a flame flickering in the wind, brilliant, resilient, but constantly threatened by gusts blowing from every direction. And those winds had names. Some came from the east, riding across arid plains or rising from ancient deserts. Others came from the north, descending snowy mountains. Still others came from the west, bearing crosses on their banners and ambition in their eyes. The empire endured among enemies, both seen and unseen, facing centuries of conflict, fragile alliances, and sieges that nearly erased it. But there was always something in Byzantium that refused to die. From its earliest centuries, Byzantium had to confront the rising power of the Sassanid Empire of Persia. The Persians, with their ancient civilization and disciplined armies, clashed with Byzantium over control of regions like Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Syria. These were wars of attrition, where victory was measured not in territory, but in time. During the reign of Heraclius in the 7th century, the conflict reached dramatic heights. The Sassanids invaded Palestine, captured Jerusalem, and took the most sacred relic of Christendom, the true cross. The holy city wept, and the empire seemed on the brink of collapse. But Heraclius, with courage and faith, reorganized his army, marched eastward, and in a near miraculous campaign, defeated the Persians, recovering the lost territories and the cross. But victory was fleeting. For from the sands of Arabia, something new was rising. A people united by a newly born faith, led by caliphs of unshakable fervor. Islam spread rapidly, and within just a few decades, Arab armies seized vast parts of the former empire: Egypt, Syria, Palestine, North Africa. It was more than a military defeat. It was a geopolitical transformation. Byzantium was forced to retreat, and the world map began to change. Constantinople, besieged by sea and land in 674 and again in 717, survived thanks to its mighty walls and the mysterious Greek fire, a flaming substance that burned on water and terrified the enemy. Some said it was a secret as valuable as the imperial crown itself. In the north, the Slavs pressed against the Balkan frontiers. Along the Danube, the Bulgars formed powerful kingdoms that rivaled the empire, sometimes enemies, sometimes allies. The Bulgars engaged in epic clashes, such as when Emperor Nicephorus Thurn was defeated in 811, and his skull was fashioned into a drinking cup by Tsar Krum. It was an age when diplomacy was a fragile dance, and war a constant presence. Byzantium had to be swift, wise, and ruthless. But from the west came the most treacherous threat. When Christian knights marched east during the 11th century Crusades, they claimed to be liberating the Holy Land from Muslims. Byzantium, as an Orthodox Christian power, saw potential allies in the Crusaders, but it soon became clear they did not see Byzantines as brothers, but as obstacles. During the First Crusade, Frankish armies crossed Byzantine lands without discipline, looting supplies and demanding aid. In exchange for support, they swore allegiance to Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, a vow broken the moment Jerusalem was taken. In the years that followed, the Crusades drifted far from their spiritual goals, and in 1204, the most brutal blow came. The Fourth Crusade, diverted from its original purpose, was manipulated by Venice, which sought to destroy Constantinople's commercial dominance. The Crusaders, seduced by the city's wealth, turned their swords against it, and the impossible happened. Constantinople fell to the Christians of the West. The sack of 1204 was a wound that never healed. Churches were desecrated, relics stolen, mosaics destroyed, women violated, monasteries burned. The altar of Hagia Sophia was defiled. The holy city, guardian of Orthodoxy for centuries, had been ravaged by those who bore the same cross. It was a tragedy that deepened the rift between East and West. For 57 years, Constantinople was ruled by Latin emperors, but the empire did not die. In Nicaea, a dynasty in exile regrouped, and in 1261, the Byzantines retook their capital, but it would never be the same again. To the east, a new threat emerged. First the Seljuk Turks, then the Ottomans. Faster, better organized, more numerous. The Byzantines, weakened, divided, surrounded, fought back with bravery but dwindling resources. Alliances with the West proved useless, and promised help was endlessly delayed. The city lived under constant siege, sometimes from its enemies, sometimes from its own decline. The walls still stood, but the empire behind them was a shadow of its former glory. And yet, even in the face of so many foes, the Byzantine Empire endured for centuries. And that alone is extraordinary. For to resist so long, amidst so many threats, required a rare combination of diplomacy, faith, culture, and hope. Byzantium was made of stone, but also of dreams. It was an empire caught between crusades and caliphates, between alliances and betrayals, between time lost and time created. And even when everything seemed about to collapse, it still found a way to endure. There was a light in Byzantium that did not come from golden chandeliers or mosaics reflecting the scent of sacred incense. It was a deeper light, almost invisible, yet it passed through centuries, through walls, and through languages. It was the radiance of a living, complex culture, woven from the threads of classical heritage and Christian spirituality. In a world crumbling in wars and barbarism, the Byzantine Empire kept the flame of art, knowledge, and tradition alive, not merely as a relic, but as the very essence of its existence. To enter a Byzantine church was to step into another realm. The faithful were instantly drawn to images that seemed untouched by human hands. The mosaics, crafted from tiny pieces of colored glass and gold, did more than adorn the walls. They revealed the invisible. They were portraits of the divine, windows to the eternal. Each saint's face, each gesture of Christ, every halo shimmered with meaning and reverence. Nothing was accidental. The eyes were large to see beyond. The hands, elongated, blessed the space. The frontal, solemn composition invited the viewer into contemplation, not emotion. Byzantine art did not seek to portray the world. It sought to elevate it. These images extended beyond churches. They appeared in illuminated manuscripts, in frescoes tucked away in mountain monasteries, in icons painted with almost mystical devotion. The Byzantine icon was more than art. It was visible prayer. The monks who created them fasted, prayed, and followed precise rituals so that each line would carry the presence of the sacred. In uncertain times, people sought comfort and hope in these images. It was before them they wept, pleaded, gave thanks. Yet Byzantium was not only an empire of faith, it was also an empire of knowledge. In its libraries, texts of Homer, Plato, Galen, Aristotle, and Euclid were carefully copied. These were treatises on medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, geometry, and astronomy. Byzantine scribes were the guardians of ancient wisdom, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost forever. While the Western world, after the fall of Rome, plunged into centuries of cultural loss, letters continued to breathe in Constantinople. The monasteries of Byzantium were not only spiritual centers, they were sanctuaries of scholarship. Monks studied languages, copied manuscripts, translated texts. In isolated places, far from the eyes of power and the fires of war, they kept alive the flame of reason. Mount Athos, for example, became one of the most important monastic centers of the Christian world, harboring centuries of meditation, wisdom, and silence. In the capital schools, the children of the elite studied grammar, logic, music, and geometry. Rhetoric was highly esteemed. The mastery of words was seen as a reflection of divine order. A skilled speaker could inspire the people, persuade the Senate, or comfort a city stricken by plague. And this classical legacy wasn't merely studied, it was lived. Many emperors saw themselves as new Caesars, new Platos, new Augustuses. The continuity with Rome was not a fantasy, it was an intellectual structure still breathing. At the core of this cultural universe was the Greek language. Though the empire had been born of Rome and spoke Latin in its early centuries, it was Greek that became the soul of Byzantine culture. It was the language of liturgies, imperial decrees, and philosophical works. The shift from Latin to Greek symbolized a deeper transformation, a distinct identity, a world view shaped by Herodotus, by St. John, by Basil of Caesarea. Byzantine Greek was rich in nuance, poetic in tone, and carried both the glories of antiquity and the mysteries of heaven. And then there was the music. Byzantine chants, with their long, unmeasured melodies, floated through churches like sonic mist. They were voices that seemed to rise from beyond. Without instruments, only the human voice echoing through vaulted domes, the sacred words soared with solemnity and softness. It was not music meant to entertain, but to transform. Vestments, rituals, court ceremonies. Everything in Byzantine culture was steeped in symbolism. The emperor's purple robe was not just royal attire, it was the symbol of Rome's legacy and divine consecration. Religious processions, relic parades, imperial baths, weddings, funerals. Every moment of Byzantine life was wrapped in layers of tradition, memory, and meaning. Even in times of crisis, Byzantine culture continued to radiate. It shaped Russian art, influenced Balkan liturgy, inspired Islamic architecture, and taught the medieval West that knowledge had not perished. When the Renaissance began to bloom in Italy, many of the texts that reawakened European thought had been preserved in Constantinople by Byzantine monks. Byzantine culture was not a decoration of the empire, it was its skeleton, the invisible structure that held everything in place when war toppled walls, when treasures were looted, when palaces fell. And perhaps that's why, even after the fall of the city in 1453, the culture continued to live within Orthodox churches, in books, in songs, in memory. It was the light that defied the darkness, the reminder that the human spirit, when nourished by faith, by art, and by wisdom, never fully fades. Behind the golden mosaics, the sacred liturgies, and the gleaming domes of Hagia Sophia, there was a silent world, a parallel universe where power was contested not only on battlefields, but within the shadowed corridors of the great palace. The Byzantine Empire, monumental in culture and faith, was also a stage upon which human drama unfolded with tragic intensity. In certain eras, the true battlefield was not a besieged fortress or a devastated plain, but the imperial court itself. And in that theater of ambition, betrayal, and twists of fate, emperors rose like falling stars, flaring brightly for a moment, then vanishing into obscurity or disgrace. The empire bore the weight of its own grandeur. To wear the purple in Byzantium was to shoulder the impossible. An emperor was expected to be a strategist, theologian, diplomat, general, patron of the arts, and guardian of orthodoxy, all at once. A single misstep, a poorly chosen alliance, a drought, a plague, or even a whisper in the dark could end a reign. And often, the emperor's greatest enemies were not beyond the walls, but seated beside him at the table. For centuries, the Byzantine throne was the object of desire for ambitious generals, scheming eunuchs, rural aristocrats, and even monks. It was common for a legitimate emperor to be overthrown, exiled, blinded, or murdered by his successor, sometimes by someone who had sworn loyalty only days earlier. The game of power was an unstable board, where the past mattered little, and the future was decided by blades, Senate votes, or conspiracies whispered in secret gardens. A rumor by night could bring down an empire by morning. Some emperors ruled for decades and left lasting legacies, like Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, who consolidated borders and strengthened central authority. But others were fleeting, forgotten, brief. Men who rose to the throne by sword, by inheritance, or by chance, and fell like leaves in the wind. In some periods, especially between the 7th and 11th centuries, imperial succession was marked by chaos. Amid civil wars, usurpations, and assassinations, some years saw 3 or 4 emperors in rapid succession, each trying to erase the name of the last and etch his own in eternity. These instabilities weakened not only the throne's authority, but the very fabric of the empire. Trust in institutions eroded. Generals became lords over entire regions. Borders grew vulnerable. The people, peasants, merchants, artisans, suffered under rising taxes, property confiscations, and the looming threat of renewed war. In this atmosphere, the court became a place where silence was survival, where glances mattered more than words, where alliances could dissolve over dinner, where even the emperor might awaken, surrounded by those sworn to protect him. And it wasn't only men who moved the gears of power. Many women left their mark on this intricate game. Empresses like Zoe and Theodora in the 11th century ruled with firm hands. Zoe married 3 times, remaining on the throne for decades as emperors rose and fell. Theodora, her sister, governed wisely and firmly, remembered as one of the last strong rulers before irreversible decline. And then there were the eunuchs, central figures in Byzantine politics. Because they posed no dynastic threat, they held key positions, controlled imperial access, directed campaigns, and even decided succession. Men without heirs, but with immense influence. Alongside all this came economic crises. In times of misrule or prolonged war, the empire's coin, the once stable Byzantine solidus, lost value. Inflation devoured the people's livelihood. Tax collection grew harsh. Corruption spread through administrative ranks. Positions were bought. Decisions were traded for favors. And justice became a luxury for those who could afford it. And still, the empire endured, like a worn tapestry, still hanging. Because there was always hope of renewal. A fairer emperor, a loyal general, a financial reform, a monk with a prophecy. It was as if Byzantium never gave up on itself, as if, deep within its collective soul, it believed survival was its destiny, that even among shadows, there would still be light. In the cold halls of the imperial palace, beneath frescoes faded by time, kings once knelt and then vanished. And yet the throne remained, waiting for the next. Because in Byzantium no one was eternal, But the idea of empire never died. For centuries, Constantinople was seen as invincible. Its stone walls told stories of resilience. Its gates had withstood Sassanid armies, Arab tides, Slavic legions, and Ottoman fleets. But the deepest blow would not come from the infidels. It would come from brothers in faith, bearing the cross of Christ, proclaiming themselves liberators of the Holy Land. The year was 1204. The Fourth Crusade, diverted from its original purpose, became the instrument of an unprecedented tragedy. The sack of Constantinople was not merely the physical ruin of a city, it was the spiritual wound of the Byzantine Empire, a scar that never healed. The Crusades, launched in the 11th century, had been called under the pretext of protecting Christian pilgrims and reclaiming Jerusalem from the Muslims. But they quickly became geopolitical enterprises, full of ambition, promises of glory, and greed. The Fourth Crusade, summoned by Pope Innocent III in 1202, was meant to strike Egypt as a strategic step toward the Holy Land. Yet the Crusaders, impoverished and indebted, became easy prey for mercantile and political interests. Venice, eager to expand its dominance over the eastern Mediterranean, saw opportunity in the internal weaknesses of Constantinople and proposed a detour. The empire was vulnerable. Internally, it was mired in yet another chaotic succession. Isaac II Angelus had been deposed, blinded, and imprisoned by his own brother, Alexios III. His son, Alexios IV, fled and promised the Crusaders vast sums in exchange for help restoring him to the throne. The Crusade leaders agreed. In 1203, the Crusaders landed at Constantinople, not as pilgrims, but as mercenaries. And when Alexios IV was reinstated, the promised payments could not be delivered. The Byzantine people, already exhausted by decades of taxes, crises, and instability, revolted. A palace coup deposed the new emperor. And then, the Crusaders made their final decision: to invade. At dawn on April 13th, 1204, Constantinople, the sacred city, guardian of Orthodoxy, last heir of the Roman Empire, fell. But what followed was not merely military conquest. It was the systematic dismantling of a soul. Churches were looted, sacred relics broken or stolen and taken west. The Basilica of Hagia Sophia, where emperors had been crowned, where the Holy Spirit was invoked in 1,000 chants, was desecrated. Horses defecated on the altar, prostitutes danced upon icons. The gold from mosaics was scraped from walls. Millennia-old liturgical vessels were melted for their weight, not their spiritual worth. Palaces were pillaged, tapestries torn, libraries set aflame. Unique works of classical antiquity, copied for centuries with care, vanished in smoke or into foreign hands. The city's people were massacred, raped, enslaved. Men slaughtered in the streets, women violated before their own altars. The sack lasted for days, and when it ended, what remained was not a conquered city. It was a humiliated one, stripped of its millennial dignity. The Crusaders divided the empire among themselves, creating the so-called Latin Empire of Constantinople. But they failed to maintain control. The Byzantine structures, though ravaged, still had deep roots. 3 resistant states emerged: the Empire of Trebizond, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Nicaea. It was this last one that, in 1261, under Michael VIII Palaiologos, managed to recapture Constantinople. But the empire that returned was no longer the same. The city lay in ruins. Its population diminished. Its wealth vanished. Its international alliances deteriorated. The trust between Orthodox East and Catholic West shattered beyond repair. Religious reconciliation became nearly impossible. For the Byzantines, the West was no longer ally, but traitor, and that distrust would mark the centuries to come, even in the face of new threats, like the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. The sack of 1204, for many historians, was the moment when the fall of the Byzantine Empire became irreversible. From that point on, any restoration was only partial. Constantinople lost its role as the universal capital of Eastern Christianity and became a city besieged by its own memory. The Palaiologan dynasty, which would rule the empire until its final fall in 1453, fought not only against external enemies, but against the constant shadow of destruction left behind by the Crusaders. And yet, even in ruin, there was still light. Byzantine culture did not disappear. Monks continued to copy manuscripts. Artists rebuilt icons. Bells still rang in churches. The people still lit candles before holy images. Faith did not die, because the spirit of Byzantium was made of something no sword could destroy. The year 1204 was an eclipse, a darkening of the light, a silence in the hymn, a pause in eternity. But like every eclipse, it left a mark, not only in the sky of history, but in the soul of a civilization, a soul that still whispers, among the ruins of the eternal city. It was as if the city were breathing its final breath, as if every stone of Constantinople, every icon, every wall, every shadow cast over the Bosphorus knew that the end was near, but not a sudden end, rather, a slow fading. The Byzantine Empire, once the Colossus of the East, was reaching its final song. And as with all things that were once great, its fall would not come without dignity. It would be a noble twilight, tragic, melancholic, a slow collapse, sung between prayer and steel. After the city's reconquest in 1261, the Palaiologan Empire was but a shell of what it once had been. The Constantinople that Michael VIII Palaiologos reclaimed was an emptied, wounded, plundered city, an echo of its former glory. The treasury was empty, the fields ravaged, and the people divided. The emperors who followed struggled to preserve the essentials, control of the city, the Orthodox faith, and the illusion of power. But the empire no longer had the strength to resist the winds blowing from the east. For while Constantinople retreated into its memories, a new power was rising with force. The Ottoman Turks, led by skilled dynasties and disciplined warriors, gradually took over the lands once ruled by Byzantium. City after city fell as they forged a new empire, rooted and ambitious. In 1451, a 19-year-old ascended the Ottoman throne, Mehmed II. But beneath his youth lay strategy, patience, and a dream. The dream of taking Constantinople. On the Byzantine side, the throne was held by Constantine the Palaiologos, an emperor without wealth, without an army, without trustworthy allies, but with a courage that would make him a legend. What he inherited was not an empire, but a city surrounded by enemies. The imperial domains had shrunk to Constantinople itself, and a few scattered fortresses. Yet in the face of the impossible, Constantine did not flee. He chose to resist. He chose to die as emperor. Mehmed II prepared his siege with surgical precision. He ordered the construction of a fortress north of the Bosphorus to cut off supplies. He gathered an army of 100,000, complete with heavy artillery, cavalry, and trained infantry. And with him, he brought a deadly innovation, massive cannons, designed by Hungarian engineers, capable of breaking even the legendary Theodosian walls, which had stood for nearly 1,000 years. The siege began in April 1453. For weeks, the walls were bombarded. The city's population, around 50,000 souls, prayed without ceasing. The last faithful, soldiers, monks, and citizens, gathered under the imperial banner, knowing each day might be their last. Within the city, churches sang continuous hymns. On the walls, young and old fought with clubs, spears, boiling oil, and atop the highest towers, the last Byzantine eagles still fluttered in the wind. On the night of May 28 to 29, the city fell into silence. Prayers intensified. Bells rang for the last time. Constantine V entered the Hagia Sophia, knelt before the golden altar, confessed his sins, and then went to the walls, donning his armor. He told his men, "I am no longer your emperor. I am only a soldier among you." And with sword in hand, he vanished among the city's final defenders. In the early hours of May 29th, the Ottomans launched their final assault. The walls gave way. The gates were breached. The city was taken. And after more than 1,000 years, Constantinople fell. Constantine V's body was never found. It is said he was only recognized by the embroidered eagles on his breastplate. And thus, the last Roman emperor disappeared, like an echo in eternity. But the new conqueror did not destroy everything. Mehmed II entered the city with respect. He declared the Hagia Sophia a mosque, preserved part of the population, protected libraries, and made it the capital of his empire. Constantinople became Istanbul, and the world changed forever. The fall of the Byzantine Empire marked the end of an era. The last living legacy of Rome had passed, and yet something remained. For the books that survived made their way to Italy, fueling the Renaissance. The Byzantine rites continued in Orthodox churches. The memory of the empire endured in monasteries, icons, and chants. The spirit of Byzantium was not buried with its walls. It lives on in every golden dome of Eastern Europe, in every manuscript preserved with care, in every liturgical chant that echoes in the mountains of Greece, in every whispered memory of a solitary monk. Because some empires do not die, they become legend. Some empires vanish like dust in the desert, swallowed by the wind of time, their ruins buried beneath layers of silence. But there are also empires that persist, not with legions or banners, but through ideas, memories, symbols, and songs. The Byzantine Empire, though it fell physically in 1453, was never erased from humanity's consciousness. It lives in golden fragments atop Orthodox domes, in the cadence of liturgies, in the pages of forgotten books, in sacred words whispered in ancestral tongues. Byzantium was never merely a place. It was, and still is, a spirit that transcends centuries. Today, to walk through Istanbul is, unknowingly, to walk over the bones of ancient Constantinople. Beneath modern avenues and bustling cafes lie the foundations of imperial palaces, vanished churches, forums where philosophers once debated the nature of the soul. Hagia Sophia, once a cathedral, then a mosque, then a museum, and now again a mosque, stands as a silent witness to a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Its columns, mosaics, and domes tell a story that never ends. But the Byzantine legacy goes far beyond stones. It lives in the heart of the Orthodox Church. From Greek cathedrals to Serbian, Bulgarian, Russian, and Georgian churches, liturgical tradition, sacred icons, and rituals remain almost unchanged. Every gesture, every chant, every veil and candle harks back to the Byzantine world, as if time had frozen at the moment of the fall, and was reborn, renewed, in each generation of believers. Byzantine orthodoxy is not a relic. It is continuity, a golden thread stretching across centuries, binding millions in the same faith, the same words, the same mysteries. In law, the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian is still studied as one of the foundations of Western legal systems. Centuries before Europe rediscovered logic and codified law, the Byzantines had already organized the fundamentals of what we now call justice. Roman law, revised, preserved, and disseminated by Byzantium, passed through the Middle Ages and helped shape modern constitutions, treaties, and courts. Thus, even without knowing it, millions today live under laws shaped by an empire that fell over 500 years ago. In Chardas, the golden glow of Byzantium still shines in museums across the world. Orthodox icons, with their solemn lines and penetrating gaze, continue to inspire modern artists. Byzantine aesthetics, its arches, its colors, its modal music, influenced styles from Imperial Russia to the Italian Renaissance, and even modern architecture. Every time someone gazes at an ancient mosaic, reads an illuminated manuscript, or hears a liturgical chant in ancient Greek, they are, whether they realize it or not, hearing the echo of Byzantium. In universities, the study of Byzantine civilization continues to grow. For a long time, the Western academic world underestimated Byzantium, dismissing it as a decadent shadow of Rome. But that has changed. Today, it is recognized that Byzantium was not merely a bridge between antiquity and the Renaissance. It was a full civilization, with its own logic, intellectual brilliance, and spiritual depth. To study Byzantium is to understand how a people could endure for 1,000 years, even while surrounded by collapse. And then there is the invisible legacy, the hardest to measure, cultural memory. In every people who resisted invasion, who preserved their language, who lit candles in caves to keep their faith alive, there is something Byzantine. Because the empire taught that civilization is not just conquest and wealth. It is resilience. It is memory. It is the ability to keep a candle burning, even when everything around goes dark. In times of change, of war, of collapse, the example of Byzantium remains a silent reminder. Even the most powerful empires may fall, but ideas endure. Faith endures. Culture endures. And as long as someone speaks the name of Constantine, sings the psalms of the ancient liturgy, or gazes at an icon with tearful eyes, Byzantium lives. And perhaps that is its greatest legacy, to teach the world that in the end, what remains are not the walls, but the meanings they once held. That a civilization can be wounded, plundered, betrayed, but never forgotten. Because Byzantium was made of something time cannot erase, the desire for eternity.